Boy brought his whole life savings to buy a dead woman's trash. Nolan Presley said it loud, the way men say things when they want a room to agree with them, and the room did. The laughter came up hard and fast through the Caldwell County estate sale barn, bouncing off the corrugated roof until it seemed to have no single source, just a solid wall of it surrounding a 20-year-old standing alone in the middle of the floor, holding a water-damaged suitcase that had not been opened in 11 years. The boy's name was Damon Reid, and he did not look at Presley. He had learned before he could read that looking at a man who is laughing at you only gives him more material to work with, what none of them knew. Presley with his belt buckle the size of a hubcap, or the estate sale regulars with their folding chairs and their decades of practice deciding what a thing was worth before they touched it, was that Damon Reid had a carpenter's memory, not for wood, for paper, for the particular shape of words written in a hand he had spent his whole life trying to find more of, and that battered suitcase had belonged to the woman who wrote them. If you have ever been the only person in a room who knows what something is actually worth, stay until the end, because what Damon found inside it did not just change his life. It changed what the town of Caldwell was willing to call the truth. The suitcase had come up third in the afternoon session, behind a cedar wardrobe nobody wanted, and a set of cast-iron skillets that went for more than they had any business going for. The estate belonged to a woman named Harriet Goss, who had died at 81 in the house she had lived in for 50 years, leaving behind no children, a modest savings account, and 11 years' worth of belongings that her appointed executor, a county attorney named Presley, had decided to liquidate rather than catalog carefully. Damon had been standing at the back of the barn since 10 that morning. He had driven 2.5 hours from Macon in a truck that burned oil and ate the left lane. And he had not eaten since the gas station outside of Forsyth because he had $38 in his account. And every cent of what he'd brought with him was rolled in a rubber band in the breast pocket of his jacket, and he needed all of it. He was 20 years old and worked nights at a loading dock outside Macon and days on whatever job site would have him, and he had the hands to prove it. His grandmother had called him Damon the Patient, which he had taken as a compliment until he was old enough to understand it was also a warning. She had also, in the last year of her life, told him something that the rest of the family had worked hard to call the delusion of a sick woman. She told him that his grandfather, a man named Clarence Reid who had died before Damon was born, had not abandoned the family the way everyone said he had. She told him that Clarence had left something behind, that a woman in Caldwell County had it, had kept it all these years because she was the one person in the county who had not been afraid to, that the woman's name was Harriet Goss. His grandmother had died with that name on her lips, and a look on her face that was not peace exactly, but something close to it, the way a person looks when they have finally said the one true thing they have been carrying too long. Damon had driven to Caldwell County 3 days after the funeral. He had arrived to find a handmade sign taped to the mailbox of 14 Linden Road, a state sale. Saturday. He had written down the date and driven back to Macon and worked every shift he could pick up for 8 weeks. He arrived on Saturday with $412 in cash and the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting so long for something that waiting has become its own kind of habit. The suitcase sat in a lot by itself on a folding table near the barn's side door, which was already a sign of how seriously the estate had been cataloged. It was brown leather, or had been once. The water damage had gone deep enough to stain the hide the color of old rust, and the brass latches had gone green, and the handle had separated at one end and been repaired with electrical tape that was now itself dry and crumbling. A handwritten tag tied to the handle read, "Contents, ASS, start bid $25. Contents unknown was the most dishonest thing Damon had read all year, and that included the contractor who had billed him for hours he hadn't worked. He knew what was in it. He did not know exactly. His grandmother had not been in a position to be exact. But he knew the shape of it, papers, possibly photographs, the kind of thing that an old woman keeps in a locked suitcase for 11 years instead of a filing cabinet, because a filing cabinet can be opened by people you don't trust, and a locked suitcase with you in the room is something else. He had no way of proving any of this. That was the whole point of being there. The bidding opened at 25 and nobody moved. An estate sale regular in the third row leaned over to her neighbor and said something that made both of them look at the suitcase and then look away, the way people look away from a thing when they have already decided it isn't worth their eyes. The auctioneer, a compact man named Gerald Sims, who ran these sales 4 Saturdays a month, and had long since stopped expecting the unexpected, waited the mandatory 10 seconds with a practiced air of patience. Damon raised his hand. He felt the room shift. Not dramatically, more the way a room shifts when someone does something slightly out of order, like standing up in a theater before the lights go down. A few heads turned. Presley, who had been standing near the side wall with his arms crossed in the posture of a man overseeing something beneath him, looked over and found Damon's face with the slow deliberation of a man who has never once been surprised to find someone disappointing him. 25 from the young man in the back. Sims said it with a thread of something in his voice that was not quite mockery, but was available to become it if the room wanted. Presley uncrossed his arms. He didn't want the suitcase. Everyone in that barn could have told you that. Nolan Presley had spent 22 years as the county attorney for Caldwell, and in that time had developed the particular confidence of a man who had never once needed to value anything he couldn't sell. He looked at Damon the way he looked at most things, checking the price tag, finding it low and moving on, except that a young black man spending what was clearly real money on a piece of dead woman's luggage was sufficiently unusual to be worth the 5 minutes it would take to make a point of it. 30, Presley said. He didn't want the suitcase. The room knew it immediately and settled in the way a crowd settles when it recognizes a sport beginning. 40. Damon's voice came out even. He had not expected it to. 50. Presley answered before Sims could close his mouth, and now he had half turned to the room, playing to the familiar faces, the regulars and the neighbors who had known him since he was carrying his father's briefcase around the courthouse square. 60, 70, 80. Someone near the front laughed. It was not a mean laugh, exactly. It was the laugh of a person watching a fixed fight who has already placed their bet on the obvious winner. 100. The room went a different kind of quiet. Damon had gone above what a water-damaged suitcase with unknown contents was worth by any logic available to the people in that room, and the bid sat in the air for a moment while everyone recalculated. Presley studied him. The boy was not bluffing, which was not what Presley had expected, and the things that Nolan Presley did not expect had a way of irritating him at a frequency nobody else could hear. He spread his hands. "You know what," he said, "loud enough for the back row. Keep it." He waved the thing away with the ease of a man demonstrating generosity. "I'm not going to bid against a boy over a lady's old luggage. Let him have his treasure hunt." Sims wiped his eye. Going once, going twice. Sold for $100 to the young man in back. The laughter followed Damon all the way to the front table, and it was of a specific kind. The laughter people who were certain they had just watched someone make a mistake, and who found that certainty comfortable in the way that certainty usually is, right up until it isn't. He counted out the 120s. His hands did not shake. That was the thing he had promised himself on the drive up. Whatever happened, his hands would not shake. The suitcase was his where it sat. He lifted it off the table. The electrical tape handle held. He carried it out to the truck in the afternoon light without looking at anyone, set it carefully on the passenger seat, and drove to the far end of the gravel lot and parked under a pin oak and sat there for a while with his hands on the wheel, breathing. He had been told his whole life, not cruelly, always with the best of intentions, that what his grandmother believed about Clarence Reid was a grief story, that old women made meaning where there was none, that his grandfather had left because men like that left, and that no amount of wanting a different answer would grow one. His mother had said it gently. His uncle had said it plainly. His high school counselor, when he'd made the mistake of mentioning it once, had said it in the specific tone schools use for students who need to be redirected towards something productive. He sat under the pin oak until the gravel lot had mostly emptied, and then he drove 40 minutes to the motel on Route 9, where he'd paid for a room the night before, and he carried the suitcase inside, and he set it on the bed. The latches were the first problem. The green had gone deep into the brass mechanism, and the years had done what years do, and neither latch would move when he pressed the release. He worked at them for a while with the small flathead he kept in his jacket pocket for job site use, easing the oxidation loose without forcing the mechanism, because he did not know what was inside and he was not going to destroy it finding out. The left latch gave first, with a sound like a very small apology. The right took longer. He worked it in the low light of the motel lamp. The overhead fixture had a bulb out, and he hadn't asked the front desk to fix it, because he had not wanted to explain why he needed the room to be particularly bright tonight. And when the right latch finally released, he sat back on his heels and looked at the lid for a moment before he opened it. He thought about Clarence Reid, which he did not often allow himself to do because the shape of the man in his imagination had always been uncomfortable. The family story was a clean one, a man who left. Damon had grown up in the gap that story made, in the particular hollow that children grow up in when they are told their missing person is simply gone. No further questions. His grandmother had been the only one who would not tell it that way. She had sat with him on her porch in the evenings when he was small, and she had said, "Your grandfather was not that kind of man." And she had said it with the specific authority of someone who is not making an argument, only stating a fact, the way you state a fact when you were there and everyone else was not. He opened the suitcase. The first thing he saw was not papers. It was a dress, folded with the care of something set aside deliberately rather than packed in a hurry, pale blue cotton gone soft at the fold lines. He lifted it out carefully and set it beside him on the bed. Under it was a pair of photographs in a cardboard folder of the kind that portrait studios used through the middle of the last century. He opened it. Two people, a man and a woman, young, standing in front of a building Damon did not recognize. The woman was Harriet Goss. He knew this because there was a later photograph of her in the estate sale pamphlet Sims had printed up, and the bones of the face were the same. The man beside her was black, which he had not expected, and tall, with the particular posture of someone who has learned to take up exactly the space he is entitled to and no more. And the name on the back of the photograph, written in the same hand as the letters he would find next, was Clarence. Damon sat with the photograph for a long time, long enough that the lamplight went amber, and the parking lot outside got quiet and the ice machine down the hall cycled twice. Then he read the letters. There were 14 of them, spanning 8 years, from 1987 to 1995. They were written by Clarence Reid to Harriet Goss, and by Harriet Goss to Clarence Reid, kept together in a bundle wrapped in wax paper that had done its job and kept the water out, which was perhaps the single thing in that suitcase that had gone exactly right. They were not love letters, or not only. They were the letters of two people who had been witnesses to the same events, and who were trying to figure out, over the course of 8 years and 14 exchanges, whether the truth of those events would ever be speakable out loud. The events were these. In 1986, a man named Owen Greer had died in Caldwell County, leaving behind a parcel of land in the northern part of the county, a house and a will. Owen Greer had been a white man of some local standing, the kind of standing that in a small southern county means your name is on a building somewhere, and people lower their voices slightly when they say it. He had also, as it turned out, been a man of some private convictions that did not match his public ones, and when the will was read, it contained a provision that the county's sitting powers had found inconvenient. Owen Greer had left his land, 42 acres of good timber property in the northern part of Caldwell, to the man who had worked it with him for 11 years, a man named Clarence Reid. The will had been contested within 3 days of its reading. The challenge was brought by Owen Greer's nephew, a man who had not set foot in Caldwell County in 6 years, and who retained a lawyer from Atlanta and who had in his corner, doing the quiet work that such men do in such circumstances, the county attorney. The county attorney at that time was not Nolan Presley but his predecessor, a man named Hugh Tarrant, who had since died, which was perhaps why Presley felt comfortable having inherited both the office and, it seemed from the letters, certain of its arrangements. Clarence Reid had fought it for 2 years, with a local attorney who was good but outgunned. He had produced witnesses. He had produced the original will. He had a statement from Harriet Goss, who had been the only person in the room besides Owen Greer himself when the will was drafted, because Harriet had been Owen's housekeeper for 30 years, and Owen had trusted her and had wanted someone he trusted to see it signed. The challenge had prevailed anyway. The land went to the nephew. The legal fees took most of what Clarence had saved, and then, in 1989, something happened that was not in the letters because it didn't need to be, the way a thing that everyone already knows doesn't need to be written down. Clarence Reid left Caldwell County. He drove out on a Sunday morning and he did not come back, and the family story that grew up around that departure was the one Damon had grown up inside, a man who left. But Harriet Goss had kept writing, and Clarence had kept writing back from an address in Memphis that shifted twice over the years. And what the letters said between them, in the careful, indirect language of two people who know their mail might be read, was that Clarence had not left. He had been made to leave. There had been a conversation. The letters referred to it only as the conversation. Always with the article, always as though both of them knew exactly which one. And in that conversation, he had been told in language that did not admit of misunderstanding, that if he continued to press the matter of Owen Greer's land, he would find that Caldwell County had a long memory and a short patience, and that his family, which included a wife and 2 small children, would find the county considerably less hospitable than it had been. He had left to protect them. He had left and let the town call it abandonment, because the alternative was a danger he could not ask his family to live inside, and because he trusted that one day the letters, which Harriet had promised to keep, would say what he could not say out loud. He had died in Memphis in 1998 without coming home. Damon's grandmother had known some of this and had kept her knowledge in the space between what she could prove and what she could say, which is where a lot of truth lives in a lot of families. Damon read the last letter twice. Then he laid all 14 out on the motel bed in chronological order, and he looked at them for a while and he did not cry, which surprised him because he had expected to. What he felt instead was something quieter and more structural, the way a building feels when someone finally installs the load-bearing wall it was always designed to have. The shape of his life had just become something it was always supposed to be. He did not sleep. He sat in the orange chair by the window as the night went long, and he let himself think about his grandfather with the photograph in his hand. Not the man who left, the man who stayed as long as he could and then went away to keep his family safe, and who wrote 14 letters in 8 years to make sure someone had the truth written down, and who had bet everything on the faith that the right person would eventually have the right reason to open a locked suitcase. The right person had cost $100. That seemed about right. He was on the road before 6 in the morning, with the letters in a manila folder he'd bought from the motel's small supply cabinet, and the photographs in his breast pocket, and the empty suitcase in the truck bed, because he did not know yet what you did with a thing like that, and it seemed wrong to leave it in a motel. Room in Caldwell County. He went to the county courthouse when it opened. He had not known, driving up, what exactly he expected to find. A lawyer, maybe. Someone who would tell him he needed a lawyer. What he had not expected was what he found, which was that the Caldwell County deed records were public, that the challenge to Owen Greer's will was a matter of public record, and that 20 minutes with a county clerk named Mrs. Patton, who had the demeanor of a woman who had long since made her peace with what the county had been, and had not stopped doing her job anyway, gave him a copy of every relevant document, stamped, dated, and arranged in chronological order. She had also, while she was at it, told him who he might want to talk to at the State Bar Association. She said it the way people say the thing they're not supposed to say, looking at the papers rather than at him, her voice at the same volume as everything else she'd said. He thanked her. She nodded. They both understood what had just happened. He called a legal aid office in Macon from the courthouse steps. They took his name and the facts in the order he had them and told him to bring everything in. He drove home. The months that followed moved the way justice moves when it moves at all, which is to say unevenly and slowly, and with the frequent sensation that nothing is happening until suddenly something is. The 14 letters could not by themselves undo a property transfer that had been legally executed 30 years ago. That was the first thing Damon learned, and it sat in him heavily for about a week until the second thing, which was that the letters were not the only evidence, only the beginning of it. Because Harriet Goss had kept other things besides the letters. He had not found them on the first night because they were in the dress. He had not opened the dress because it was a dress. And he had not thought to unfold it until the attorney at the legal aid office, a young woman named Soraya Kamani, who had the particular focused energy of someone who had been told 100 times that a case wasn't worth pursuing, and had developed a specific relationship with those 100 people's opinions, suggested he go back through everything. In the dress, folded into the bodice with the care of something hidden rather than stored, was a sealed envelope. Inside it was a handwritten note from Harriet Goss addressed to whoever finally gets into this, which Damon had to sit down to read, and a second document beneath it, an affidavit, notarized, dated 1997, in which Harriet Margaret Goss stated under penalty of perjury that she had been present at the signing of Owen Greer's will, that the will had been signed freely and in sound mind, and that she had been visited in 1988 by two men, one of whom she identified as Hugh Tarrant, the serving county attorney, who had suggested to her in terms she described as not subtle that her continued employment prospects in Caldwell County were connected to her willingness to keep certain opinions about the validity of the Greer will to herself. She had kept those opinions to herself for 11 years, and then written them down and sealed them in a dress and put the dress in a locked suitcase. And the reason she had not told anyone while she was alive, she wrote in the note to whoever finally gets into this, was that Hugh Tarrant was dead by the time she wrote the affidavit, but the men he had worked with were not, and a woman her age in Caldwell County could not afford the kind of attention that coming forward would bring. But she was not going to let it disappear with her, either, and so she had done the only thing available to her. She had put it somewhere that the wrong people could not easily find it, and she had made sure the estate sale made it available to find. The note ended with a line that Damon read 4 times on the morning Soraya called to tell him what the Bar Association had said about Nolan Presley's role in the management of the Greer estate. It said, "I knew Clarence Reid for 11 years, and I never once met an honester man, and I could not let him leave this county with only the story they told about him. I'm sorry it took so long. What happened to Nolan Presley happened the way these things happen, in public documents and professional proceedings, and the particular language of accountability that does not always feel like justice, but is the closest the legal world gets to it." The Bar Association finding was referral-worthy. The referral became an investigation. The investigation found what investigations find when someone has finally given them the right place to look. Presley had not run the original suppression. That had been Tarrant's work, but he had known about it when he inherited the office, and he had done nothing. And doing nothing, when you know, is its own specific failure. He did not go to prison. That was the thing Damon had to make his peace with. The mechanism was too old and too much of the harm too long ago, and the law has specific ideas about what it can reach back and touch. But Presley resigned from the county attorney's office on a Wednesday morning in February with a statement that 3 people read, and he left Caldwell County shortly after, and his departure was of the kind that generates no ceremony. The land was gone. 30 years of transfers and sales and subdivisions meant that the 42 acres Owen Greer had left to Clarence Reid was now 6 different parcels with 6 different owners. And the courts were not going to unwind 30 years of property law on the strength of letters and an affidavit, however honest. That was the thing Damon had sat with the longest. In the evenings when he drove back to Caldwell for the various proceedings and stayed at the same Route 9 motel, and thought about what winning looked like from where he was sitting. The land was gone. His grandfather was gone. 11 years of his grandmother's life spent believing something that everyone around her had been glad to call delusion. Those years were gone too. But the story was not gone. The story was now a matter of public record, stamped and filed and placed in the permanent collection of a county courthouse in Caldwell, Georgia, where it would sit as long as the building stood and anyone who wanted to find it could. And that was something. It was not everything, but it was something that had not existed before a 20-year-old in a truck that burned oil had driven 2.5 hours and spent his last $100 on a dead woman's battered suitcase. Mrs. Patton, the county clerk, had done something on her own initiative that Damon did not find out about until later. She had placed a small typed card in the deed records room below the framed county seal that said only, "The Greer Raid Record 1986-2023, see Index." It was not a monument, it was a card. But every person who came into that room to look up a deed would see it. And some of them would look, and some of those people were the grandchildren of the people who had laughed in that auction barn. Damon kept 3 things. He kept the 14 letters, which he had photocopied and given to Soraya and the Bar Association, and kept the originals in a fireproof box under his bed, the way you keep something that belongs to more than just you. He kept the photograph, the young man and the young woman in front of the building, with Clarence written on the back in Harriet's hand. He had it framed and put it on the wall of his apartment in Macon, and in the evenings sometimes he looked at it and let himself see his grandfather. Not the man the town had described, not the story his family had been given, but the man who stood in that photograph with the posture of someone taking up exactly the space he had earned, and no more. And he kept the motel receipt for the night of October 14th, with the checkout time and the room number, and the $100 charge for the suitcase still rubber-banded to it, because a man should know what he spent his last money on, and whether it was worth it. He drove back to Macon on a Tuesday afternoon in March, through the long, flat counties that lie between Caldwell and home, and at some point on that drive, he couldn't have said exactly where, somewhere between a town with a closed diner and a town with an open one. It occurred to him that he was not angry anymore. He had been angry for a long time, long enough that the anger had become a kind of background frequency he'd stopped hearing as separate from himself. And now it was quieter, the way a room gets quiet when the thing that was making the noise has finally said what it needed to say. He was not done. He was 20 years old and he was not done by a long measure. But he knew now what his grandfather's hands had built and what his grandfather's name deserved to carry. And he knew it not because someone had told him, but because he had driven 2.5 hours and paid $100 and sat alone with the truth until he understood it. Here is the thing worth taking with you from Damon Reid's story. When a town decides what a person's life was worth, it usually decides fast, on the available evidence, the way a roomful of buyers decides the value of a water-damaged suitcase. Quick, certain, loud about it. But the available evidence is almost never the whole evidence. It's just the evidence that's easiest to see, which is not the same thing. There are 14 letters in more families than anyone wants to count, wrapped in wax paper and locked in things that haven't been opened yet. And the difference between those letters staying locked and the truth getting out is almost always one person who couldn't let the available story be the last word. Clarence Reid trusted that person would come. He just didn't know it would take 23 years, or that the person would be his grandson, or that it would cost exactly $100. Sometimes it's worth asking yourself, what locked thing in your own family have you been told isn't worth the trouble of opening? Leave your answer below if you're willing. And if Damon's story stayed with you, share it with one person who needs to hear today that a man who gets written out of the story isn't necessarily gone from it. He might just be waiting in the right place for the right set of hands.